The millionaire's daughter was only 7 days old when the doctor finally said the words Victoria Hamilton dreaded most. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing more we can do. The syndrome is too rare. Her liver has simply stopped working." Victoria held little Isabella close to her chest, feeling her fragile body fight for every breath. 7 days. That was all her daughter had lived in this world. And now the best pediatric specialists in the country were giving up on her. "Is there any possibility of a transplant?" she asked, her voice breaking, though she already knew the answer that would come. "For a baby only a week old, we would need a compatible donor immediately. And even then," Dr. Peterson shook his head gravely, "the chances are slim." On the other side of the neonatal ICU glass, Antonio Silva watched the scene in silence. At 32, he had been working as a driver and personal assistant for the Hamilton family for only 6 months. Yet he had accompanied them to every doctor's appointment, every test, every night of despair since Isabella was born. Victoria never noticed how Antonio always stayed longer than necessary at the hospital, how he asked the doctor specific questions when she wasn't around, or how his eyes filled with tears every time he looked at the little girl, fighting for her life. What she didn't know was that Antonio had been carrying a secret for years, a secret he discovered at 19, when he tried to enlist in the army and underwent mandatory medical exams. He had an extremely rare blood type. Only 1 in 500,000 people had that specific combination. "It's like winning the genetic lottery," the military doctor had joked at the time. "You can save lives that no one else could save." Antonio never imagined those words would make so much sense years later, watching a 7-day-old baby waste away while her mother wept helplessly. He had overheard the doctors mention the rarity of the blood type needed. He had seen the test results scattered across the office table, and he knew exactly what he had to do. That night, while Victoria finally fell asleep, exhausted in the chair next to the incubator, Antonio remained in the hallway, staring through the glass. Isabella seemed smaller with each passing hour, her lips turning purple as she struggled against the artificial respirator. He pulled a yellowed envelope from his pocket, his old blood test results, which he had carried in his wallet since the day he discovered his genetic peculiarity. For a moment he hesitated. He was just the driver, a black employee of a wealthy white family. Who would believe that he wanted to help out of genuine love and not out of self-interest? But when Isabella opened her tiny eyes for a few seconds and seemed to look directly at him through the glass, Antonio knew there was no turning back. If you're enjoying this story of courage and overcoming adversity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what this man was about to do would forever change the definition of family, proving that true love knows no color, social class, or barriers imposed by prejudice. The next morning, Antonio arrived at the hospital 2 hours earlier than usual. He needed to talk to Dr. Peterson before Victoria woke up, before the other doctors arrived, before he lost his courage. "I'm sorry, sir, but the neonatal ICU does not allow unauthorized visitors," said the nurse at the desk, not even looking up from her computer when he approached. "I work for the Hamilton family. I need to talk to the doctor about baby Isabella." The woman finally looked at him, her eyes lingering on his simple clothes and dark skin. "The driver, right? Look, you'll have to wait for Mrs. Hamilton to arrive. Doctors don't discuss cases with employees." Antonio felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced 15 years ago when he graduated from medical school at the public university but couldn't get a residency at any private hospital because he didn't fit the right profile to deal with high-class patients. After 3 years of trying and failing to secure an opportunity, he had given up on medicine. He worked as a nurse in low-income clinics, then as an ambulance driver, until he finally accepted the job with the Hamilton family. But he never forgot his training. He never stopped studying in his free time. "I can wait," he said calmly, sitting down in the hallway. When Victoria arrived 2 hours later, her eyes were swollen from crying. Isabella had endured a terrible night. Convulsions, uncontrolled temperature, increasingly weak vital signs. "Mrs. Hamilton." Antonio stood up as she passed. "Can I talk to you?" Victoria stopped, surprised. In 6 months of working together, Antonio had never initiated a personal conversation. "Of course, Antonio," What is it? He pulled the yellowed envelope from his pocket, his hands trembling slightly. I can help Isabella. Victoria frowned, confused. How? I have the blood type she needs, the same one the doctor said would be impossible to find. I had these tests done years ago. His voice faltered for a moment. I would like to be tested as a donor. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria looked at him as if he were speaking another language. Antonio, that's very kind of you, but you don't understand. The doctor said she would need a compatible donor from the family, someone with genetic ties. With all due respect, ma'am, they're wrong. Antonio opened the envelope and showed her the papers. Blood type O negative with Duffy antigen negative. Only 1 in 500,000 people have that combination. I'm one of them? Victoria took the papers, but Antonio could see the hesitation in her eyes. It wasn't mistrust about the tests. It was about him. A black driver wanting to donate part of his liver to save the daughter of a white millionaire. What kind of interest could he possibly have? Antonio, I deeply appreciate your offer, but this is very complex. The doctors would need to evaluate so many things, and there are legal issues, and can I talk to him directly? Antonio interrupted gently, his voice firm but calm. Antonio interrupted gently, holding out the tests for the doctor to see. Victoria nodded, but Antonio could tell she had already decided it wouldn't work. 30 minutes later, Dr. Peterson examined the papers with obvious irritation. Silva, Antonio Silva. Mr. Silva, I understand your concern about the situation, but organ donation is an extremely complex process that goes far beyond blood compatibility. There are genetic factors, histocompatibility issues, hospital protocols. I understand perfectly, doctor. Antonio kept his voice calm. That's why I suggested specific tests for HLA antigens, cross-matching, and... Dr. Peterson interrupted him, clearly surprised by his technical knowledge. How do you know these terms? Antonio hesitated. Revealing his medical training would mean admitting that he had been living undercover as a driver for years. I've done a lot of research on her case. Look, the doctor sighed impatiently. Even if you are compatible, there are protocols. A living donor must undergo psychiatric, social, and financial evaluations. Hospitals do not accept donors who may have questionable motives. The implication was clear. A poor black man offering to donate an organ to a rich white child could only have ulterior motives. What kind of motives? Antonio asked quietly. Well, you've only been working for the family for a short time. Organ donation is a significant gesture. Some may question whether you expect financial compensation or other benefits. Antonio felt anger rising in his throat, but he took a deep breath. Doctor, if you'll allow me, I'd just like to have the specific tests done. If I'm not a match, forget I ever suggested this. Dr. Peterson looked at Victoria, who nodded hesitantly. All right, he said reluctantly, but don't get your hopes up. The chances are slim. And even if you are compatible, there are many other issues involved. 3 days later, Antonio received a call. Dr. Peterson's voice sounded different, tense, almost incredulous. Mr. Silva, you need to come back to the hospital today. Antonio knew exactly what that tone meant. The tests had confirmed what he already suspected. He was a perfect match, so perfect that it would be statistically impossible to find another donor like him. But when he arrived at the hospital, he found Victoria crying in the hallway, surrounded by a group of doctors in heated discussion. Mrs. Hamilton? He approached cautiously. What happened? Victoria lifted her tear-stained face. The tests. You are indeed compatible. Perfectly compatible. She paused, as if she couldn't believe her own words. But they won't authorize the surgery. Antonio felt his heart race. Why? It was Dr. Peterson who answered, avoiding his gaze. The Hospital Ethics Committee has decided that there are too many risk factors involved. Liability issues, safety protocols, translation, Antonio said slowly. You don't trust me. The silence was the answer he needed. That night, alone in his small apartment, Antonio looked out the window and thought of the 7-day-old baby fighting for her life a few miles away. He thought of Victoria, who treated him kindly, but never truly saw him as someone capable of saving her daughter. He thought of the doctors who questioned his motives simply because he was black and poor. He opened his old laptop and began to search. There had to be other options, other hospitals, perhaps in other states, where the rules were different, where a man like him could save a child without his skin color being seen as a risk factor. Isabella was dying, and inside his body was exactly what she needed to live, and if the system wouldn't let him do it the right way, maybe it was time to find out how many rules a man desperate to save a life was willing to break. What those doctors didn't know was that Antonio Silva wasn't just a well-meaning driver. He was a trained physician who had spent 15 years studying exactly this type of surgery, waiting for a chance to prove that competence has no skin color. Antonio didn't sleep that night, sitting at the kitchen table in his small apartment, surrounded by stacks of printed medical articles and pediatric surgery books. He reverted to who he truly was, Dr. Antonio Silva, who had graduated from a federal university with a medical degree 15 years ago. He had lied to the Hamilton family from day one, not because he wanted to deceive them, but because he knew a black doctor who had been unemployed for years due to prejudice would never even be considered for a driver's job with a wealthy white family. It was easier to be seen as a competent driver than to explain why a qualified physician was behind the wheel instead of in an operating room. But now, looking at Isabella's medical records, documents he had discreetly photographed during consultations, Antonio saw exactly what the doctors were missing. Isabella's syndrome was rare, yes, but there were documented cases of successful transplants. The problem wasn't medical. It was political. At 3 o'clock in the morning, his phone rang. It was Dr. James Mitchell, his college classmate, who now ran the pediatric transplant program at St. Mary's Children's Hospital in another state. Antonio, man, it's been years since we last spoke. I saw your message about the neonatal liver transplant case. Antonio explained everything. Isabella's condition, the perfect compatibility tests, the hospital's refusal on so-called ethical grounds. My God. James sighed on the other end of the line. Are you telling me they rejected a perfectly compatible donor because they think you have ulterior motives? That's medical insanity. James, I need help. This child will die if we don't do something. Wait a minute. You said you work as a driver. What happened to your medical career? Antonio hesitated before telling the truth. How he had been rejected from every residency program 15 years ago despite excellent grades. How private clinics dismissed him for not having the right profile for our patients. How he had given up on medicine and taken any job that paid the bills. Man, that's unacceptable. You were one of the best in our class. James went silent for a moment, then said, Antonio, what if I told you that I can authorize this transplant here? Our protocols are different. As long as he passes the medical and psychological evaluations, we can do the surgery. Antonio felt his heart race. Would you do that? Of course I would. But there's a problem. You'd need to bring the baby here without the consent of her current doctors. Technically, it would mean transferring a critically ill patient without formal medical authorization. What about the legal risks? For you? Enormous. For me? Manageable, if we justify it as a medical emergency. But Antonio, if something goes wrong during transport or surgery, you could be held criminally liable. Antonio looked at the photo of Isabella pinned to his refrigerator, her tiny face resting peacefully in Victoria's arms, still unaware that she was dying. James, Antonio said firmly, I accept all the risks. The next day, Antonio arrived at the Hamilton mansion with a plan. He needed to convince Victoria to seek a second medical opinion, without revealing the whole truth about his qualifications. Mrs. Hamilton, may I speak with you? Victoria was in the living room, staring blankly out the window. Her eyes were swollen, as if the tears of the last few weeks had permanently stained them red. Of course, Antonio. I know a doctor who specializes in pediatric transplants. Dr. James Mitchell at St. Mary's Hospital. He would like to evaluate Isabella's case. Victoria turned, surprised. How do you know a transplant specialist? Antonio had prepared for this. My sister works as a nurse at that hospital. She mentioned Isabella's case to Dr. Mitchell, and he became interested. It was a lie, but a lie that could save a life. Antonio, the doctors here have been very clear. There's no more hope. With all due respect, ma'am, sometimes it's worth hearing a second opinion. Dr. Mitchell has saved children in similar cases. Victoria hesitated. Over the past few days, she had noticed something different about Antonio. He asked the doctors technical questions no ordinary driver would know. He used medical terms with ease, and there was a determination in his eyes that went far beyond the concern of an employee. You understand medicine, Antonio? Antonio took a deep breath. It was time to reveal part of the truth. Yes, ma'am. I have a degree in medicine. I haven't practiced in years due to personal circumstances, but I never stopped studying. Victoria stared at him, shocked. You're a doctor? Why didn't you tell me that before? Because I knew you wouldn't hire me. An unemployed black doctor doesn't inspire confidence in families like yours? The brutal honesty of the answer hit Victoria like a slap in the face. She knew he was right. She would never have hired a doctor as a driver. She would have assumed ulterior motives or doubted his competence. Antonio, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, ma'am. You just have to let me try to save Isabella. At that moment, Victoria's phone rang. It was Dr. Peterson. Mrs. Hamilton, I'm sorry to inform you that Isabella's condition has deteriorated significantly in the last few hours. We recommend that you prepare for the worst. Victoria collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing. Antonio knelt beside her. Mrs. Hamilton, give me 24 hours. Let me take her to Dr. Mitchell. If it doesn't work, at least we tried everything. Victoria looked at him through her tears. If you're really a doctor, why aren't you saving lives instead of driving cars? Because the system doesn't let men like me save lives, Antonio replied softly. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying. Victoria knew she was about to make the riskiest decision of her life. But looking at Antonio, really looking at him for the first time in 6 months, she saw something she had completely missed. Hope. All right. But Antonio, if anything happens to her during this trip, I take full responsibility. And Mrs. Hamilton, he said gently, my real name is Dr. Antonio Silva. That's how I want Isabella to know me when she grows up. For the first time since Isabella's birth, Victoria smiled. It wasn't happiness. It was relief. Relief at finally finding someone willing to fight when everyone else had given up. While Antonio discreetly arranged the medical transfer, Victoria stood at the window, deep in thought. She had spent 6 months living with a doctor disguised as a driver, a man who understood exactly what her daughter was going through, but who had been forced to hide his true identity because of her own prejudices. And now, that same man was risking everything, his freedom, his career, his life, to save a child who wasn't even his. Victoria realized that Isabella wasn't just lucky to have found a compatible donor. She was lucky to have found someone who loved her enough to defy an entire system that had already decided her fate. What Victoria didn't know yet was that, in less than 12 hours, Antonio would place Isabella in his car and drive 8 hours across state lines, carrying portable medical equipment. He had borrowed from the hospital, betting his life and freedom on the hope that love was stronger than the prejudices that had almost let a child die simply because her savior had the wrong skin color. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Antonio carefully secured Isabella in the back seat of his car, surrounded by portable medical equipment, a heart monitor, an infusion pump, an oxygen tank, all powered by batteries he had charged throughout the night. Victoria sat next to her daughter, holding her tiny hand, watching Antonio connect the final cables with surgical precision. You really know what you're doing, don't you? She whispered. Yes, ma'am. Trust me. The 8-hour trip was a race against time. Every 2 hours, Antonio stopped to check Isabella's vital signs, adjust her medications, and change fluid bags. Victoria watched in awe as the man she thought was just her driver transformed before her eyes. The shy, quiet chauffeur was gone, replaced by a confident, competent doctor who knew exactly how to keep a 7-day-old baby alive during a medical emergency. Antonio, she said softly during one of the stops, why did you really hide all these months? He adjusted the monitor before answering. Because I know how the world works, Mrs. Hamilton. An unemployed black doctor would be viewed with suspicion. A competent driver would simply be seen as efficient. It was easier to take care of Isabella while being underestimated than while being questioned. At St. Mary's Hospital, Dr. James Mitchell waited with his surgical team ready. When he saw Antonio step out of the car, carrying Isabella with perfectly functioning medical equipment, he smiled. My goodness, Antonio, you turned this car into a mobile ICU. Isabella couldn't wait for bureaucratic protocols, Antonio replied, transferring the baby onto a hospital stretcher. James, meet Victoria Hamilton. Mrs. Hamilton, this is Dr. James Mitchell, the best pediatric surgeon I know. The next 6 hours were the most tense of Victoria's life. Antonio remained in the operating room as an assistant surgeon, his first surgery in 15 years. Yet his hands moved with the precision of someone who had never stopped practicing. My God, Dr. Mitchell murmured during the operation. His suturing technique is impeccable. Where did he graduate? Federal University, class of 2008. And why did he stop practicing? Antonio paused, delicately connecting the blood vessels. Because no hospital wanted to give me a chance. They said I didn't have the right profile to work with certain families. Dr. Mitchell stopped for a moment, stunned. Antonio, you're saving this child's life with a technique that rivals Harvard surgeons. Any hospital that rejected you lost one of the finest doctors they could have had. Meanwhile, just 400 meters away, Dr. Peterson received a call that made his face turn pale. What do you mean they took the patient to another state? Who authorized that? Sir, the nurse stammered. The family's driver. Apparently he's a doctor. He transferred the baby to a specialized hospital in the middle of the night. Dr. Peterson felt his blood run cold. A doctor disguised as a driver had been observing procedures for months, questioning decisions, taking notes, and they had rejected the only compatible donor simply because they didn't trust his motives. Call the legal department. Now, he shouted. But it was too late. At 3:00 p.m., Dr. James Mitchell emerged from the operating room with a weary smile. The surgery was a complete success. Antonio's liver has adapted perfectly to Isabella's body. She is stable, awake, and responding well. Victoria collapsed in the hallway, crying with relief. Antonio, still in surgical scrubs, approached quietly. Can I see her? Victoria asked. In the pediatric ICU, Isabella was awake for the first time in weeks. Her lips were pink, her breathing calm, and when she saw Victoria, she gave what might have been her first true smile. She's going to live, Antonio said softly. Watching the monitors, Victoria turned to him. For the first time in 6 months, she really looked at him. You saved my daughter, and I spent all this time treating you like a driver, because that's what I was to you. And that's okay. No, it's not okay. Victoria took his hand. You're the most competent doctor I've ever met, and I let my prejudices blind me. How many other extraordinary people do I dismiss every day just because they don't look like me? At that moment, her phone rang. An unknown number. Mrs. Hamilton, the tense voice said. This is Dr. Peterson from the hospital where Isabella was admitted. We need to talk urgently about the irregular transfer. There are serious legal issues involved. Victoria looked at Antonio, who was calmly checking Isabella's vital signs, the daughter who was alive only because of him. Dr. Peterson, she said coldly, you had months to save my daughter, but you chose to hide behind protocols instead of accepting the only compatible donor. Now she's alive thanks to a doctor you deemed untrustworthy. But ma'am, there are regulations, legal responsibilities. Doctor, Victoria cut him off. Prepare to explain in court why you rejected a perfectly qualified donor. Because as we speak, I'm calling the best law firm I know. She hung up and turned to Antonio. I hope you're ready to never hide again. The whole world is about to know who really saved Isabella. Antonio smiled for the first time in months. Not the polite smile of a driver, but the confident smile of Dr. Antonio Silva. Mrs. Hamilton, I never hid because I feared failure. I hid because I knew that once my true competence was revealed, it would be impossible to ignore how many others like me are being wasted by a system that judges by appearance rather than by skill. Within 48 hours, the story leaked to the press. Black doctor disguised as driver saves baby rejected by elite hospital. The headlines spread like wildfire. Antonio soon realized that saving Isabella was just the beginning of a revolution, one that would force the system to finally confront its own prejudice. But what none of them knew yet was that the real battle had just begun. Because when a man proves the system wrong, The system does not easily surrender its arrogance. 6 months later, Isabella ran through the garden of the Hamilton mansion, her rosy cheeks glowing, her laughter echoing through what was once a house of despair. Antonio stood on the terrace, now wearing his white coat, Dr. Antonio Silva, the new director of the pediatric transplant program at St. Mary's Hospital. Dr. Peterson had been fired in public disgrace. The hospital was facing a federal investigation into discriminatory practices, and 3 families had filed lawsuits for medical malpractice rooted in racial prejudice. His career was ruined, his name forever tied to the case of the undercover doctor who saved a life while specialists refused to act because of racism. Victoria approached, carrying a cup of coffee. Antonio, this arrived today. She handed him an official letter, an invitation to speak at Harvard Medical School on overcoming systemic barriers in medicine. Antonio smiled, folding the letter carefully. 15 years ago, they rejected me saying I didn't have the right profile. Today they want me to teach other doctors, and yes, I'm going to accept. He looked out at the horizon. How many other Antonio Silvas are still driving cars when they should be saving lives? Just then, Isabella came running up, wrapping her little arms around his legs. "Daddy Tony, let's play!" Victoria had insisted on a formal adoption. Antonio was no longer the driver, no longer the doctor in disguise. He was a father, chosen not by blood but by love strong enough to shatter prejudice. That night, as he tucked Isabella into bed, Antonio reflected on his journey. He had lost 15 years hiding his true identity, but he had gained something immeasurable, a daughter, and the chance to help transform a system that had almost let a child die out of pure ignorance. The best revenge was not destroying the doctors who had rejected him. The best revenge was proving, through action, that competence, love, and dedication have no skin color, and sometimes the greatest victories come from those society least expects. If this story of love and resilience touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that prove true, greatness knows no limits, and that genuine love always finds a way to triumph over prejudice.